Jake Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished checking the mining equipment for the third time that day. The asteroid belt around Kepler 442 was known for its rich mineral deposits, but it was also known for being dangerous. Space pirates, equipment failures, and worse things lurked in the darkness between the rocks. The mining ship New Dawn was not built for combat. It was a simple civilian vessel with basic shields and outdated engines. Jake had been working as the ship's engineer for 2 years, keeping the old machinery running with spare parts and prayers. He liked the quiet work and the decent pay. Most days nothing exciting happened. Today was different. The first sign of trouble came from the bridge. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the ship's communication system, tense and worried. "All hands, we have unknown contacts approaching from Sector 7, 3 large ships, military configuration." Jake dropped his wrench and moved to the nearest viewport. In the distance, he could see 3 massive vessels moving toward them. They were unlike anything he had seen before. The ships were dark gray, covered in sharp angles and weapon ports. Strange symbols glowed along their hulls in patterns that hurt to look at. "Those aren't human ships," Jake muttered to himself. The mining crew gathered on the bridge, 23 men and women who had signed up for simple work and good money. Now they stared at the alien vessels with growing fear. Captain Rodriguez tried to contact the approaching ships, but received only static in return. "Maybe they're friendly," suggested Maria Santos, the ship's navigator. Her voice shook as she spoke. Jake doubted it. The alien ships moved like predators, spreading out to surround the New Dawn. Their weapons were already charging, energy, building along their dark hulls like angry lightning. The attack came without warning. Blue beams of energy lanced out from the alien vessels, striking the mining ship's shields. The New Dawn shuddered under the impact, lights flickering throughout the corridors. Jake ran toward the engine room, hoping to boost power to the shields, but it was already too late. The second wave of attacks took out their engines completely. The ship went dead in space, powerless and helpless. Emergency lighting cast everything in a red glow as the crew waited for whatever came next. They did not wait long. The alien ships moved closer, and Jake could see them more clearly now. They were even larger than he had first thought, easily 10 times the size of the New Dawn. Strange creatures moved behind transparent sections of their hulls, working at controls that made no sense to human eyes. A new voice came over their communication system, speaking broken but understandable. "English? Human vessel, you are now prisoners of the Vraktari Empire. Surrender immediately or be destroyed." Captain Rodriguez looked around at his crew, seeing the fear in their faces. He knew they had no choice. "This is Captain Rodriguez of the mining. Vessel New Dawn. We surrender." "Good. Prepare for boarding." What followed was like a nightmare. The alien ship extended a docking tube that attached to the New Dawn with a sound like grinding metal. The airlock opened, and the aliens came aboard. Jake's first sight of a Vraktari would stay with him forever. They were tall, nearly 8 feet in height, with 4 arms and skin that looked like gray leather. Their heads were elongated, with 3 eyes arranged in a triangle and mouths full of sharp teeth. They wore armor that seemed to be part machine and part living tissue, pulsing with its own heartbeat. The aliens moved through the ship with brutal efficiency. They separated the humans into groups, scanning them with handheld devices that hummed and clicked. Some crew members were marked with red symbols on their foreheads, others with blue or green. Jake received a blue mark. He did not know what it meant, but he would learn soon enough. The Vraktari took everything of value from the ship: mining equipment, personal belongings, even the ship's computer cores were loaded into their vessels. The humans were herded into small transport pods, barely large enough for 3 people each. Jake found himself squeezed between Tom Walsh, the ship's cook, and Lisa Park, a young mining technician who was crying quietly. The transport pod had no windows, so they could not see where they were going. The journey took several hours, during which the aliens gave them no food or water. When the pod finally opened, Jake stepped out into a massive cargo bay filled with other prisoners. There were humans from other ships, but also creatures he had never seen before. Some looked like giant insects, others resembled lizards that walked on 2 legs. All of them wore the same expression of fear and confusion. The cargo bay was part of a ship so large that Jake could not see the other end of it. The ceiling disappeared into darkness far above, and the walls were lined with cage-like holding areas. Thousands of prisoners from dozens of different species were kept here, all waiting for whatever the Vraktari had planned for them. A group of Vraktari guards approached, their armor clanking with each step. They carried weapons that looked like they could cut through solid steel, and their three eyes constantly scanned the prisoners for signs of trouble. One of them, larger than the others and covered in scars, stepped forward. His armor was different, marked with symbols that suggested high rank. When he spoke, his voice was like grinding stone. "I am Sergeant Zekthor. You are now property of the Vraktari Empire. You will work, you will fight, or you will die. These are your only choices." The sergeant's three eyes focused on Jake, studying him with obvious contempt. "Humans," he said, spitting the word like it was poison. "Weak creatures with no natural weapons, no armor, no strength. You are barely worth keeping alive." Jake said nothing, but he met the alien's gaze without backing down. This seemed to amuse Zekthor, who made a sound that might have been laughter. "We shall see how long that spirit lasts, human. We shall see." The prisoners were divided into groups and led away to different sections of the ship. Jake's group was taken to a series of small cells carved directly into the ship's hull. Each cell was barely large enough for one person to lie down, with no furniture and only a small drain in the floor. As the cell door sealed shut behind him, Jake sat down and tried to think. He was trapped on an alien ship, light years from Earth, with no way to contact home and no hope of rescue. The Vraktari clearly saw humans as inferior beings, useful only as slaves or cannon fodder. But Jake had spent his entire adult life solving problems with limited resources. He had kept broken machinery running in the depths of space, turned scrap metal into working tools, and found solutions where others saw only impossible challenges. The aliens might think humans were weak, but they were about to learn something important about human nature. When pushed into a corner, humans did not just survive. They adapted, they improvised, and they fought back. Jake reached into his pocket and felt the small plastic toothbrush he always carried. The Vraktari had taken everything else, but they had not bothered with something so seemingly worthless. They would learn to regret that mistake. 3 days passed in the cramped cell before Jake saw sunlight again. The Vraktari fed their prisoners once per day with a gray paste that tasted like metal and provided just enough nutrition to keep them alive. Water came from a small tube that extended from the wall for exactly 60 seconds every 12 hours. Jake had used the time to study his surroundings. The cell walls were made of some kind of metal alloy that felt warm to the touch. The door was a solid barrier with no visible controls on the inside. Air came through tiny holes near the ceiling, carrying strange smells from other parts of the massive ship. On the morning of the 4th day, the cell doors opened with a sound like breaking glass. Vraktari guards stood outside, their weapons drawn and ready. They wore different armor than before, lighter and more flexible, suggesting they expected movement rather than simple intimidation. "All prisoners report to Training Bay 7, announced a mechanical voice from speakers hidden in the walls. "Movement begins now. Delay will result in immediate termination." Jake stepped out of his cell along with dozens of other prisoners. The corridor outside was wide enough for 10 people to walk side by side, with a high ceiling that disappeared into shadows. Strange lights moved along the walls in patterns that made his eyes water if he looked at them too long. The other prisoners were a mix of species Jake had never imagined. There were the insect-like creatures he had seen before, their 6 legs clicking on the metal floor as they walked. The lizard people moved in a different way, their tails swishing behind them as they maintained perfect balance. One group caught Jake's attention immediately. They were roughly humanoid but covered in thick, dark fur. Their arms were longer than their legs, and their faces were dominated by large eyes and sharp teeth. When one of them looked at Jake, he could see intelligence there, and something else: fear. The training bay was enormous, easily the size of a football stadium. The floor was covered in a dark material that felt soft under Jake's feet but showed no wear despite the thousands of prisoners who had walked across it. The ceiling was transparent, showing the stars beyond and reminding everyone that they were trapped in the depths of space. Sergeant Zekthor stood in the center of the bay, surrounded by a display of weapons that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. Energy rifles that glowed with their own inner light. Bladed weapons that seemed to cut the air itself as they moved. Projectile weapons that looked like they could punch holes through solid rock. The sergeant's scarred face showed satisfaction as he watched the prisoners gather around him. His three eyes moved constantly, cataloging each prisoner and making some kind of mental assessment. When his gaze fell on Jake, those eyes narrowed with what looked like anticipation. "Welcome to your final examination," Zekthor announced, his voice carrying easily across the massive space. "Each of you will demonstrate your combat capability. Those who prove useful will be assigned to military units. Those who fail will be disposed of immediately." A murmur of fear ran through the gathered prisoners. Jake noticed that some of the other species did not seem surprised by this announcement. They had clearly been through similar experiences before. "We will begin with the Kickstra," the sergeant continued, gesturing toward the insect creatures. One of them stepped forward, its compound eyes reflecting the strange lights of the training bay. What followed was both fascinating and terrifying. The Kickstra moved with incredible speed, its 6 limbs allowing it to attack from multiple angles, at once. Sharp spines extended from its forearms and it demonstrated its ability to spit a substance that ate through metal like acid. When it finished its demonstration, several Vraktari officers nodded in approval. The lizard people, called Shalmek, showed different but equally impressive abilities. They were incredibly strong, able to crush metal bars with their bare hands. Their tails could strike like whips and their teeth could bite through substances that would break human tools. More importantly, they moved with a coordination that suggested natural military discipline. Each species demonstrated natural weapons and abilities that had been refined by millions of years of evolution. Claws that could cut through armor, poison that could kill in seconds, strength that could bend steel, speed that made them nearly invisible when they moved. Jake watched it all with growing concern. Humans had none of these advantages. No claws, no natural armor, no poison, no incredible strength or speed. From a purely physical standpoint, humans were among the weakest species in the galaxy. Finally, Sergeant Zekthor's attention turned to the small group of humans. There were 12 of them from various captured ships, all looking terrified and hopeless. The sergeant approached them slowly, savoring their fear. "And now we come to the humans," he said, making the word sound like a curse. "The species that thinks it rules its little corner of space despite having no natural weapons whatsoever." He stopped directly in front of Jake, close enough that the human could smell the alien's breath, which was like hot metal and sulfur. "You especially interest me, engineer. You have been watching everything with those little eyes of yours, calculating and thinking. Do you believe your soft species has anything to offer the Vraktari military?" Jake met the alien's three-eyed gaze without flinching. "Every species has something to offer," he said quietly. Zekthor's mouth opened in what might have been amusement, showing rows of sharp teeth. "How inspiring. And what exactly do humans offer? You have no claws." He gestured with one of his forearms toward the weapon display. "You have no natural armor. You have no poison, no superior strength, no speed worth mentioning." The sergeant moved closer, towering over Jake's smaller frame. "Your species is barely evolved from the primitive creatures you once were. The only reason you achieved space travel is because you had no natural predators forcing you to evolve proper survival traits." Other prisoners were watching now, some with pity, others with curiosity. The Vraktari guards had formed a loose circle around the demonstration area, clearly expecting entertainment. "But we are not entirely without mercy," Zekthor continued. "Choose any weapon from our display. Show us what your pathetic species can accomplish with superior Vraktari technology." Jake looked at the impressive array of weapons, plasma rifles that could melt through solid rock, Gravity hammers that could crush enemies without even touching them. Energy blades that could cut through any known material. Projectile weapons that fired rounds at significant fractions of the speed of light. All of them were clearly designed for beings much larger and stronger than humans. The smallest rifle was nearly as long as Jake was tall, and probably weighed more than he could comfortably carry. Even if he could operate one of these weapons, he would be trying to use tools designed for a completely different species. Jake reached into his jumpsuit pocket and pulled out his small plastic toothbrush. It was blue and white, slightly worn, from use, completely unremarkable in every way. He held it up so that everyone could see it clearly. "This will do," he said. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The training bay erupted in laughter from the Vraktari guards and officers. Even some of the other prisoners seemed amused by what appeared to be either insanity or a very poor joke. The sound echoed off the high ceiling and transparent walls, a chorus of mockery that seemed to go on forever. Sergeant Zekthor's expression changed from amusement to something much darker. His scarred face twisted into a snarl of rage and his forearms flexed as if he wanted to tear Jake apart immediately. "You dare mock the Vraktari Empire?" he roared, his voice drowning out all other sounds in the training bay. "You think this is amusing?" Jake held the toothbrush steady, looking completely calm despite the alien's rage. "I think this is the weapon I choose to use." The sergeant's 3 eyes blazed with fury. He stepped back and gestured sharply to his guards, who immediately raised their weapons. For a moment, Jake thought he might be killed on the spot. Instead, Zekthor seemed to regain control of himself. A cruel smile spread across his face as he looked down at the human holding nothing but a piece of plastic. "Very well, human. You want to play games? We will play games." He turned to address the other prisoners and guards. "This creature thinks it can create a weapon from garbage. We will give it exactly 1 day to prove its worth." The sergeant moved closer to Jake again, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried threat beyond anything he had shouted. 24 hours, engineer. Create a real weapon from your little toy, or I will personally ensure that your death provides entertainment for every prisoner on this ship." As the guards began herding the prisoners back to their cells, Jake pocketed his toothbrush and began to plan. The other humans looked at him with expressions ranging from pity to anger, clearly believing he had doomed himself with his strange choice. But Jake was already thinking 3 steps ahead, remembering every piece of equipment he had seen during the journey to the training bay, cataloging every resource that might be available to him. The Vraktari saw only a piece of plastic dental care equipment. Jake saw possibility. Jake's cell felt smaller after his return from the training bay. The walls seemed to press in around him as he sat on the hard floor, turning the plastic toothbrush over in his hands. 24 hours to create a weapon or die. Most people would consider this an impossible task. Jake considered it an engineering problem. He had spent 15 years working with machinery in conditions where failure meant death. Deep space mining operations, orbital construction projects, emergency repairs, on ships millions of miles from the nearest port. Every job had taught him the same lesson. With enough creativity and determination, almost anything could be turned into something else. The first challenge was getting access to materials. The Vraktari had not searched him thoroughly when they brought him back to his cell, which suggested they truly believed he posed no threat. This was both insulting and useful. 3 hours after his return, a guard appeared at his cell door. This one was smaller than Sergeant Zekthor, with armor that looked more functional than decorative. Its 3 eyes studied Jake with what might have been curiosity. "Human engineer," the guard said in heavily accented English. "You are assigned maintenance duty. Ship systems require repair work that small hands can accomplish more efficiently than Vraktari hands." Jake stood up immediately. "I'm ready to work." The guard led him through corridors he had not seen before, deeper into the ship's interior. The walls here were lined with pipes and cables, humming with energy that made Jake's skin tingle. They passed work areas where other prisoners labored under guard supervision, repairing equipment and cleaning components. His work assignment was perfect. A section of the ship's environmental system had developed a fault that required someone to crawl into tight spaces and replace damaged components. The work area was littered with spare parts, tools, and maintenance supplies. Jake set to work immediately, but his real attention was on cataloging everything around him. A broken maintenance drone sat in one corner, its power cell removed, but still containing residual energy. Coils of wire hung from hooks on the walls, some of it damaged and destined for recycling. Chemical cleaning supplies sat on metal shelves, their labels written in Vraktari script but their purposes obvious from their containers and smells. The guard watched him for the first hour, then gradually lost interest as Jake proved to be both competent and focused on his assigned tasks. By the third hour, the alien was reading something on a handheld device and paying almost no attention to his prisoner. Jake began his real work. The toothbrush came apart easily in his hands. The plastic handle was hollow, designed to be lightweight but strong enough for daily use. Jake smiled as he examined the internal structure. The designers had included small ridges and reinforcements that would serve his purposes perfectly. Working slowly and carefully to avoid attracting attention, he began modifying the handle. A thin strip of metal from a damaged cable housing became a spring mechanism. He tested the compression and release, adjusting the tension until it felt right. The bristle end of the toothbrush required more complex work. Jake removed the bristles entirely and began reshaping the plastic. Using a small heating tool meant for sealing pipe connections, he softened the material and formed it into a different configuration. What emerged looked like a small cone with carefully calculated angles. By the time his work shift ended, Jake had made significant progress on both his assigned repairs and his secret project. The guard escorted him back to his cell, where Jake continued working by feel in the darkness. The second phase of construction required more sophisticated materials. Jake had identified what he needed during his work shift, but obtaining it would require careful timing and a bit of luck. The next morning brought another work assignment, this time in a different section of the ship. Jake found himself cleaning and maintaining the computer systems that controlled various ship functions. The work required him to handle small electronic components, many of which were damaged beyond repair. A Vraktari technician supervised this area, but unlike the guard, from the previous day, this one seemed actively interested in Jake's work. It watched everything he did with its three eyes, occasionally asking questions about human engineering techniques. Your species uses very inefficient methods, the technician observed as Jake worked on a damaged display panel. Vraktari technology is superior in every way. Jake nodded politely while palming a small capacitor from a pile of broken components. We do our best with what we have. Yes, I have heard about your primitive tools and methods. It is amusing that you believe you can create weapons from grooming implements. Word of Jake's challenge had apparently spread throughout the ship. The technician seemed to find the entire situation entertaining, which worked in Jake's favor. Entertained guards were less likely to pay close attention to exactly what their prisoners were doing. Over the course of the day, Jake acquired several more components. A small piece of conductive mesh from a damaged sensor array, a tiny amount of high-energy chemical compound from a cleaning solution that was clearly more potent than anything used on Earth. Most importantly, he managed to extract a micro-power cell from a handheld device that had been discarded as beyond repair. That night, working by touch in his cell, Jake began the final assembly process. The toothbrush handle now contained a complex mechanism. The spring system he had built would compress when the handle was squeezed, then release with considerable force when a small trigger was pressed. The reshaped bristle end would focus and direct that force in a specific direction. The capacitor and power cell created a small but potent electrical system. When activated, it would charge the conductive mesh for exactly 3 seconds before, discharging all of its energy at once. The chemical compound, carefully measured and contained in a tiny chamber Jake had carved from the plastic, would provide additional acceleration when ignited by the electrical discharge. The result was a weapon that operated on 3 different principles simultaneously. Mechanical spring force provided the initial acceleration. Electrical charge created a magnetic field that further accelerated the projectile. Chemical combustion provided a final boost that would propel a small metal object at extraordinary velocity. Jake had no metal projectile, but that was easily solved. The button from his jumpsuit was made of a dense alloy designed to withstand industrial washing and wear. It was small, aerodynamic, and when properly shaped, would fly with remarkable accuracy. As the final hours of his deadline approached, Jake put the finishing touches on his creation. The weapon looked exactly like a slightly modified toothbrush. Anyone examining it casually would see nothing more than a piece of personal hygiene equipment, perhaps damaged or worn from use. Only someone with extensive engineering knowledge would recognize the sophisticated mechanisms hidden within the innocent plastic exterior. Jake had essentially built a miniature railgun using materials that any prisoner might have access to, disguised as something so mundane that no one would give it a second look. The most elegant part of his design was its single-shot nature. Jake could have built a more complex weapon that fired multiple times, but that would have required more obvious modifications and larger components. Instead, he had created something that would work perfectly once, with devastating effect, and then appear to be nothing more than a broken toothbrush. When his cell door opened for the final time, Jake was ready. He held his creation casually, as if it were indeed nothing more than the grooming tool it appeared to be. The Vraktari guards who escorted him to the training bay seemed amused by his calm confidence, clearly expecting to witness an entertaining execution. Jake smiled to himself as they walked through the corridors. The aliens were right about one thing. Humans had no natural weapons, no claws or poison or incredible strength. But they had something else entirely. They had the ability to look at any problem, no matter how impossible it seemed, and find a solution using whatever materials were at hand. They could turn trash into treasure, junk into precision equipment, and a simple toothbrush into something that would change how an entire military empire viewed the species from Earth. The training bay doors opened, and Jake stepped into the arena where he would either prove his point or die in the attempt. In his hand, a plastic toothbrush hummed almost inaudibly with contained energy, waiting for its moment to show the galaxy what human engineering could accomplish. The Vraktari were about to learn that underestimating humans was a very dangerous mistake. The training bay was more crowded than Jake had ever seen it. Word of the humans' impossible challenge had spread throughout the ship, and it seemed like half the Vraktari crew had come to witness what they expected would be an amusing execution. Officers stood in elevated viewing areas, their armor gleaming under the bright lights. Guards formed a loose circle around the demonstration area, their weapons ready but relaxed. At the center of it all stood Sergeant Zekthor, his scarred face showing satisfaction and anticipation. He had clearly put considerable thought into this moment, arranging an elaborate series of targets that would demonstrate the futility of Jake's supposed weapon. The first target was a standard armor plate, the kind used on Vraktari personal protective equipment. It was thick, dark gray, and designed to stop energy weapons and projectiles alike. Behind it stood a second target, an active energy shield generator that cast a shimmering blue barrier in the air. The third target made Jake's breath catch in his throat. It was a decommissioned Vraktari combat drone, roughly the size of a small car and covered in sensors and defensive systems. Even inactive, it looked incredibly dangerous, with weapon ports and armor plating that suggested it had once been a formidable opponent. "Welcome, human engineer, to your final performance," Sergeant Zekthor announced, his voice carrying easily across the massive space. The assembled crowd of aliens fell silent, clearly anticipating entertainment. Jake walked forward slowly, his modified toothbrush held casually in his right hand. He could feel hundreds of eyes watching him, most filled with amusement and contempt. A few showed what might have been curiosity, but none showed any expectation that he might actually succeed. These targets have been selected to demonstrate the superiority of Vraktari technology, the sergeant continued. The armor plate is standard issue for our military forces. The energy shield is designed to stop any projectile or energy beam. The combat drone possesses defensive systems that make it nearly invulnerable to small arms fire. Zekthor moved closer to Jake, his three eyes gleaming with cruel anticipation. Your pathetic species believes it can compete with superior alien technology using primitive tools and desperate improvisation. Today you will learn the price of such arrogance. The sergeant gestured toward the targets with one of his 4 arms. "You may begin your demonstration whenever you are ready. I am curious to see what your little toy can accomplish against real military equipment." Jake nodded politely and approached the firing line. The armor plate was approximately 30 feet away, positioned at chest height on a sturdy mounting system. He could see that it was genuine military equipment, not some weakened training version. The metal had a slight sheen that suggested some kind of energy-resistant coating. He raised his weapon, taking aim with the careful precision of someone who understood he would only get one shot. The modified toothbrush felt comfortable in his hand, its weight perfectly distributed for accurate shooting. The trigger mechanism he had built was sensitive but stable, requiring just enough pressure to prevent accidental firing. Around him, the alien audience began to murmur with amusement. Some were already placing bets on how quickly the human would admit defeat and beg for mercy. Others speculated about creative methods of execution that might provide better entertainment value. Jake blocked out the noise and concentrated on his target. He had spent considerable time calculating angles and trajectories during his work shifts, using his knowledge of physics and engineering to determine the optimal firing solution. The weapon he had created was crude by some standards, but it was also precisely calibrated for this exact situation. He squeezed the trigger. The weapon fired with a sound like a small firecracker, barely audible in the vast training bay. A tiny flash of light marked the electrical discharge, followed by a small puff of smoke from the chemical booster. The projectile, Jake's modified jumpsuit button, traveled too fast for the naked eye to follow. The armor plate rang like a bell as the projectile struck it dead center. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the plate split in half with a metallic shriek that echoed throughout the training bay. The laughter died instantly. Jake examined his weapon briefly, noting that the single-shot mechanism had performed exactly as designed. The plastic housing showed some thermal stress from the electrical discharge, and the chemical booster chamber was empty. But overall, the device had functioned perfectly. He looked up to find every alien in the training bay, staring at him in stunned silence. Sergeant Zekthor's 3 eyes were wide with shock, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. Several officers had moved closer to get a better look at the destroyed target. "Impossible," one of them whispered in heavily accented English. Jake walked toward the second target without waiting for permission. The energy shield generator was more complex than the armor plate, designed to stop both physical projectiles and energy weapons by deflecting them with controlled electromagnetic fields. It was exactly the kind of advanced technology that the Vraktari used to demonstrate their superiority over more primitive species. Unfortunately for them, Jake's weapon did not work the way they expected. The energy shield was calibrated to detect and deflect known types of projectiles: plasma bolts, energy beams, conventional bullets, and various forms of exotic ammunition. Its sensors could identify incoming threats and adjust the shield parameters accordingly within microseconds. But Jake's projectile was too small and fast for the sensors to detect until it was too late. By the time the shield generator recognized the threat, the button had already passed through the electromagnetic field and struck the device's central processing unit. The generator sparked once and went dead, its blue energy barrier flickering out of existence. Jake moved on to the final target before anyone could object. The combat drone represented the ultimate test of his improvised weapon. Even decommissioned, it retained most of its defensive systems. Armor plating covered every critical component, and passive sensors continued to monitor its surroundings for potential threats. This target would require a different approach. Jake circled the drone slowly, examining its construction and looking for weak points. The aliens watched in fascination and growing concern as the human analyzed their military technology with obvious expertise. There, a small gap between 2 armor plates where a sensor cluster was protected by nothing more than a transparent aluminum window. The gap was tiny, perhaps 2 inches wide and barely visible from most angles, but Jake's engineering experience allowed him to spot the design flaw immediately. He had no projectile left, but he did not need one. The weapon he had built was sophisticated enough to function in multiple ways. Instead of firing a physical object, Jake triggered the electrical discharge system without loading a projectile. The result was a focused electromagnetic pulse that traveled along the same trajectory his projectile would have followed. The pulse struck the sensor cluster and overloaded its delicate electronics. The drone's defensive systems, confused by conflicting signals from their damaged sensors, began a cascade failure that spread throughout the entire unit. Within seconds, the combat drone was completely disabled, its systems shut down by their own safety protocols. Jake lowered his weapon and turned to face Sergeant Zekthor. The alien's expression had changed completely. Where there had been contempt and amusement, now there was something approaching. Respect and perhaps even fear. How? Zekthor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake held up his modified toothbrush, which now looked like exactly what it had always appeared to be, a piece of personal hygiene equipment, perhaps slightly worn from use. Simple physics, he said. Mechanical force, electromagnetic acceleration, and chemical boosting. Any species that has achieved spaceflight understands these principles. He looked around at the assembled aliens, many of whom were still staring at the destroyed targets in disbelief. The difference is not in our technology, Jake continued. It is in how we think about problems. You see a toothbrush and think it is worthless because it was not designed as a weapon. We see a toothbrush and recognize that it is made of materials that could be reconfigured for other purposes. Sergeant Zekthor approached slowly, his forearms hanging loose at his sides. His three eyes studied Jake with new intensity, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. You built a weapon capable of destroying military equipment from grooming supplies and scrap metal, the alien said slowly, in less than 24 hours, using only materials available to any prisoner. Jake nodded. That is correct. And this is typical of your species? Jake smiled for the first time since his capture. Sergeant, you have not seen anything yet. What I just showed you is basic human engineering. Give us real tools and adequate time, and we can build things that will change how you think about warfare entirely. The training bay remained silent as the implications of Jake's demonstration sank in. The assembled aliens were beginning to understand that they had seriously underestimated the species from Earth. In the elevated viewing areas, senior officers were already talking in hushed voices about the strategic implications of humans who could turn any available material into effective weapons. On the floor of the training, the command bridge of the Vraktari vessel was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Massive displays showed tactical information in 3 dimensions, with holographic representations of star systems, fleet movements, and battle plans floating in midair. The ceiling was transparent, offering a view of space that made him feel dizzy when he looked up at it. Commander Velnash stood at the center of it all, a figure that made even Sergeant Zekthor look small by comparison. The commander was ancient by Vraktari standards, his gray skin marked by countless battle scars, and his armor decorated with symbols that spoke of victories across multiple star systems. 3 days had passed since Jake's demonstration in the training bay. 3 days during which word of his achievement had spread throughout the ship and beyond, transmitted to other Vraktari vessels through their military communication networks. The reaction had been swift and dramatic. "Show me the weapon again," Commander Velnash ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Jake held up his modified toothbrush, now carefully restored to its original appearance. To anyone who did not know its history, it looked like a perfectly ordinary piece of personal hygiene equipment, perhaps slightly worn from use. The commander studied it with his 3 eyes, turning his massive head to examine it from different angles. Around them, other officers watched in fascination. They had all heard the reports, but seeing the actual weapon was still somehow surprising. "Our engineers have analyzed your design," Velnash said. "They confirm that it operates on principles we understand but have never seen combined in such a configuration. More importantly, they believe your approach could be scaled up and applied to larger weapon systems." Jake nodded carefully. He had been expecting this conversation since his demonstration, and had spent considerable time preparing for it. "The principles are simple once you understand them," he said. "But implementation requires a different way of thinking about available resources. Your engineers focus on building the most sophisticated solution possible. Human engineers focus on building the most effective solution using whatever materials are actually available. Yes, the commander replied. This is what concerns. Sir, Velnash activated a holographic display that showed a detailed analysis of Jake's weapon. Every component was identified and explained, from the modified plastic housing to the improvised electromagnetic coil system. This device was built using materials available to any prisoner on this ship, the commander continued. Scrap metal, damaged electronics, cleaning supplies, and a personal grooming tool. Our security procedures assumed that such materials could not pose any significant threat. Jake could see where this was leading. You are wondering what humans could build, with access to proper tools and materials. Indeed. Velnash turned away from the display and fixed his 3 eyes on Jake. We have been at war with the hegemony for 12 standard years. They possess superior numbers and advanced technology. We have prevailed through superior strategy and warrior discipline, but the conflict has reached a stalemate. The commander gestured to his officers who activated additional displays showing fleet movements and battle statistics. Jake could see immediately that the Vraktari were in a difficult position, outnumbered and gradually losing territory despite their tactical advantages. Both sides have access to the same basic technologies, Velnash explained. Energy weapons, defensive shields, faster than light travel, automated manufacturing systems. Victory has gone to whoever can deploy these technologies most effectively in specific situations. Jake studied the tactical displays with professional interest. His engineering background gave him insights into the logistical challenges both sides must be facing: supply lines, maintenance requirements, resource allocation, all the unglamorous details that determined whether advanced technology actually worked when needed. But now we have encountered something different, the commander continued. A species that can create effective weapons from materials we considered worthless. This changes the fundamental equation of warfare. Sergeant Zekthor, who had remained silent during most of the briefing, stepped forward. Commander, I have observed this human carefully since his demonstration. His approach to problem solving is unlike anything I have seen from other species. 4K. Sergeant activated another display, this one showing video recordings of Jake's work assignments over the past 3 days. In each case, Jake had been given routine maintenance tasks and had completed them efficiently and effectively. But more importantly, he had improved the efficiency of several systems using modifications that Vraktari engineers had not considered. He does not simply repair damaged equipment, Zekthor explained. He analyzes why the damage occurred and modifies the design to prevent similar problems in the future. In 3 days, he has improved the efficiency of our life support systems by 12% and reduced power consumption in our computer networks by 8%. Jake smiled slightly. Your engineers are very skilled, but they work within established parameters. They assume that if something was designed a certain way, that must be the correct way. Humans question those assumptions. Commander Velnash leaned forward, clearly intrigued. What do you mean? For example, your computer networks use a distributed processing system that is very robust and difficult to damage, Jake explained. But the distribution algorithm was designed for a different type of hardware than what you are actually using. By modifying the software to match your current equipment, I was able to reduce processing overhead significantly. The commander exchanged glances with his officers. And you identified this inefficiency in a matter of hours? It was obvious once I looked at the system specifications, Jake said with a shrug. The original designers probably never expected the hardware to be upgraded the way it has been. They built something that worked perfectly for its intended purpose, but circumstances changed and the software was never updated to match. Velnash was quiet for several minutes, studying the tactical displays and clearly thinking through the implications of what he had learned. Human engineer, he said finally, we offer you a choice. You may remain a prisoner, kept in comfortable conditions but under constant guard, or you may accept a position as a technical consultant to our engineering division, with freedom of movement within this ship and access to our research facilities. Jake had been expecting this offer, but he was not prepared to accept it as stated. What about the other humans you have captured? They will remain prisoners, Velnash replied, without hesitation. Then I remain a prisoner as well, Jake said firmly. The commander's expression showed surprise and perhaps annoyance. You would refuse freedom to remain with your fellow prisoners? I would refuse to abandon people from my own species while accepting special treatment for myself, Jake corrected. That is not how humans think about loyalty and responsibility. Sergeant Zekthor made a sound that might have been amusement. Commander, I believe this demonstrates another aspect of human psychology that we should consider. They appear to value group cohesion over individual advancement. Felnash studied Jake for a long moment, his three eyes reflecting something that might have been respect. Very well. All humans currently held on this ship will be released from prisoner status and offered positions as technical consultants. Those who accept will work alongside our engineering teams. Those who refuse will be transported to the nearest human colony and released. Jake nodded his approval. That is acceptable, but you personally will work directly with our weapons development division, the commander continued. We are particularly interested in your approach to improvised weaponry and resource optimization. I can do that, Jake agreed. But I have one additional request. Velnash raised what might have been an eyebrow. Speak. I want to keep this, Jake said, holding up his modified toothbrush. As a reminder of how we started this conversation. The commander looked at the innocent piece of plastic that had changed everything, then made another sound that was definitely amusement. Granted, but I suggest you build something more impressive for your next demonstration. News of your achievement has reached other ships in our fleet, and there are those who believe one success could be simple luck. Jake smiled and carefully tucked the toothbrush into his pocket. Commander, by the time I finish working with your engineering teams, the galaxy is going to learn something very important about humanity. Which is, never underestimate a species that can turn household objects into weapons of war. We have been doing that since we invented fire, and we have gotten very good at it. 6 months later, the war between the Vraktari Empire and the hegemony ended in decisive victory for the Vraktari. The turning point came when human-designed weapons began appearing on battlefields throughout the contested territories, weapons that used principles no one had seen before, built from materials that should not have been capable of such destructive potential. Jake Martinez, now wearing the insignia of a Vraktari senior technical advisor, stood on the bridge of the flagship watching the final hegemony fleet surrender. In his pocket, he still carried a blue and white plastic toothbrush, carefully preserved as a reminder of the day humanity proved